Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Skilled Fawn. Today we are going to be doing an Elden Ring challenge run. Let's waste no time and jump straight into the rules. Starting off, we can only use consumables. Consumables are items that vary from throwing daggers to fire pots. When these items are used, they do not replenish. This is the opposite of tools, which can be used infinitely. I covered tools only previously, and I'll link this above and in the description for those who are intrigued. It will be interesting to see how consumables fare with enemies and bosses. Next, no spirit summons. Subsequently, I must beat the game and DLC. Afterwards, I must defeat all remembrance bosses. I cannot use armor. Lastly, glitches and or exploits are allowed, so expect some cheeky ways to get around areas and take down bosses. I'm excited to share this run with everyone. I really enjoyed the Souls series. Make sure to smash the like button, comment, and subscribe to help support me and the channel. Hit the bell icon to be notified when I post similar challenges. Now, let's get into the run. As always with an Elden Ring run, we beeline it to Melina to receive Torrent. Afterwards, we grab the two halves of the Dectus medallion alongside defeating this NPC. Defeating him will give the player a golden seed, an upgrade material for flasks. Regarding the medallion, one is located in Limgrave and the other in Caelid. This will allow me to enter Altus Plateau much easier. Knowing that I needed some runes to spend on consumables and levels, I pressed further into Caelid. Many tough bosses can be found here, but also many cheeseable bosses, especially early game. Starting off was the Commander O'Neill cheese. Lure him over to this rot pool and have him get hit over and over. The only real threat is when he summons axe-wielding warriors to fight by his side. For how early we are in the run, it would be a one-shot instant death. Subsequently was Flying Dragon Grail. This cheese is a lot more RNG dependent and requires the player to exploit his movement, forcing the dragon on top of this tree. If done correctly, Grail will go into this T-pose like animation and get insta-killed. Having some runes to my name, I decided to head down to Weeping to purchase from this merchant. Another reason was that I wanted to get the Sacred Tier upgrade materials for the flasks since there are 3 located in Weeping. Back in Caelid, we meet up with another merchant. This guy's a bit more useful since he sells rot materials that are needed for crafting alongside poison consumables. With some prep work done, we are at a good point to start taking down some remembrance bosses. Entering Stormvale Castle, Margit blocks the path ahead to Godric. Using the Kukri daggers alongside the various poison items, we take them on. Consumables definitely are putting in the work. This is a super early game boss, so we shouldn't conclude its viability quite yet, but it's definitely worth noting. Ultimately, we take down Margit. Upon defeating him, we receive another talisman slot. At the end of the castle, we find Godric the Grafted, our first remembrance boss of the run. Even though he may be more straightforward than other bosses, I really enjoy his fight. One thing I want to quickly mention is that I either lost or misplaced the first 2 recordings of the consumable run. Thankfully, I was streaming since I could grab the streams from my VODs channel. If you enjoy my content and want to watch the full-length challenge runs, click the link in the description. Eventually, we take down Godric. Once we take down Godric or any other rune-bearing bosses, we can claim their great rune from their respective divine towers. Godric's I really enjoy since it gives +5 points to each of your stats. Because we defeated Godric, I set my sights on other remembrance bosses. Figured Rennala would be a safe option since there are a few items useful in the area. Red Wolf is blocking our path to Rennala though. As always, Red Wolf is dang easy. It's crazy that I'm even getting yellow damage from the poison darts. Getting to the top of the academy, we find Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon. My plan for her was to fight her with poison from the get-go and try to proc bleed as often as possible. One difficult thing I found with this fight was that the numerous enemies roaming around made it difficult to lock onto Rennala. Phase 2, she becomes a ranged magic user, and this was actually fairly challenging, especially when she summons a bunch of minions to defend her. This made it tough to get hits in since the animation for the consumables can be long lasting, or put the player in a position to get hit. Sooner or later, we defeat Rennala. Next, I tried my luck with fighting Radahn, and well, yeah, it didn't work out so well. One of the later attempts was going better than the previous ones, but still wasn't able to take him down. We'll have to come back later when we have more damage and health. Getting further into Altus, we find DTS protecting one of the entrances to the capital. These guys are fairly simple, but I really enjoy their fights. Once we take him down, we enter Lindell, the capital, and fight Godfrey and Morgott. Godfrey is the spectral version of the true Godfrey, but with fewer attacks. Every time I get into this fight, I can't help humming the music. Shit slaps so hard. Morgott is much more agile than Godfrey and posed more of a threat in the challenge. Similarly with other bosses, I opted to poison the boss, then whittle him down with kukris and other consumables. In the end, we defeat both of them, earning another talisman slot and gaining a new quest of burning the impenetrable thorns. My very first Elden Ring challenge was that I had to switch weapons after defeating a boss. I quickly realized that I needed runes out the wazoo. Thinking ahead in this run, since runes are useful not only for consumables, but also leveling up, I decided to get this talisman that increases rune acquisition when defeating enemies. With some increased damage and health to my name, I returned to fight Radahn. As always, I do that exploit that forces him towards the player, and it's super satisfying to complete. Afterwards, I started to proc poison. Now, one thing I was quite disappointed about was that I couldn't rot Radahn. This is because the cookbook for the rot items are located within the Lake of Rot. Not for a bit. Even though I couldn't rot him, poison will suffice alongside the Krukri's bleed damage. Phase 2 is where things get challenging, even for an experienced player. Making sure to play things cautiously, try to time my attacks so I won't get in harm's way. Radahn ultimately gets taken down. Heading back to Liurnia, we talk with Ranni, then complete her various quests. This consists of us getting the Finger Slayer blade, getting the items from our body on top of the Divine Tower, and defeating a shadow. The reason for this is to gain access to the rot consumables, but also to eventually fight Estelle. Subsequently, I want to showcase some of the behind the scenes stuff in runs like this. I won't showcase each, but want to explain the basic gist for those unfamiliar. There are many types of consumables, but at least to explain, there are two categories. One is consumables that can be easily purchased from merchants such as Kukris. The other, the player needs to craft. These are things such as bone darts, cuckoo glintstone, and other various ritual and craft pots. Because of this, the player is going to need to spend some time grinding for materials. Now, this is one example in the run, but there were plenty of times that I had to stop fighting bosses and reset my consumables. I'd say in total, it took more than 2 hours worth of just grinding for materials, especially in some of the later sections, but I don't want to spoil too much. Following the material farming, I decided to fight Estelle, natural born of the void, and Mohg the Omen. Estelle is one of the main remembrance bosses in the run that we will face, so that is one of the reasons why I went towards him. Mohg, on the other hand, actually doesn't benefit the run much, other than some runes. There are some useful items down in the subterranean shutting grounds, but I will explain more on this shortly. Estelle is a weird boss. Yes, it does have that Lovecraftian design, but I mean, it can be bled. I personally find it strange since there are so many other examples in this game where you'd think a status effect can be proc, then you find out that that boss is immune. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this down below. In the end, we claim the runes. Next, I went towards Mount Gelmir to prepare for Rykard's fight. About halfway through the castle, the player will need to fight Godskin Noble. Now, one thing that is great about this fight is that the Godskins can be slept super easily. I opted not to use sleep pots though because I was so far away from the duo that I wouldn't get much use other than these two fights. This was pretty much my conclusion with my sleep only run, where I went through the game using only that status. I also did the other status effects such as Death Blight, Madness, and so on, so check these out if you are interested. Talk with Alexander in the lava pits. The reason for this is to acquire a pot helmet that will increase my damage with pot consumables. One of my favorite things that Elden Ring introduced is Madness and all of its corresponding lore. It is unfortunate that the player doesn't get the Frenzied Flame head after completing the journey. Thankfully, I know mods let the player equip this, so this has been something I've been meaning to do for some time, is do some modded content. So expect in the near future for me to do something. Oh, Fire Giant, easily one of my least favorite bosses in Elden Ring. Consumables made things much more bearable time-wise as I was constantly building up poison and rot. The last thing I'll mention is that thankfully I beat him on the first try, so I didn't need to suffer through his phase 2 multiple times. Because we took down Fire Giant, we were able to enter Fair Missoula and defeat its inhabitants. Two of these being the Godskins. Similarly with just the solo fight, I opted to not use sleep pots since I'd rather have more damage with a fire pot or something. Targeting the noble is the best option in my opinion, since his phase 2 is much more manageable. I made sure to stay around the pillars, ensuring that I would be ready for his roll attack. In the end, the duo didn't stand a chance. Next, I had to sadly defeat Alexander, not for the talisman he provides, but to complete the questline with the NPC in Jarburg. I mentioned earlier that I'm able to get a talisman that increases pot damage. Well, this is how. It was rather unfortunate, but we did give him that heroic fight he was always looking for. At the end of Fair Missoula and protecting Destined Death, we find Malekith the Black Blade. This is in my top Elden Ring fights because dang, that phase 2 goes super hard, especially since he's got that Demon Slayer move. That attack is chef's kiss. Since I didn't pre-plan defeating Bernal, I didn't have the Blasphemous Claw at my disposal. No matter, we will do it with pure consumables. Because at the end of the day, Malekith has very little health. Ultimately, we release Destined Death. Because we release Destined Death, the capital gets turned to ash. Now we are able to progress through with new bosses along the way. The first of which is Sir Gideon Ofnir. This was a fairly tough battle, at least for consumables only. NPCs in Elden Ring will heavily input read what the player does, so it can be extremely tough to land hits. Let's just say this foreshadowed a future calamity. Godfrey is the next obstacle that stood before us. He's another one of my favorite bosses in this game. Let's quickly talk about consumables thus far. It is important to note that consumables scale with levels, no flat damage. This is unlike Demon Souls. I previously went through and completed that challenge, and one thing I found was that no matter what, I couldn't increase my damage with leveling up. Instead, I had to use the Royal Rat Ring, aka the Red Feathered Branch Sword. Early game in Elden Ring, this is definitely a hindrance. We'll have to see how these consumables fare against Malenia, Plassey, and all the DLC bosses. Consumables are useful in proccing numerous status effects, pivotal in a fight. From Bleed to Scarlet Rot, there are numerous ways the player can engage bosses and enemies. Another thing that will be interesting to watch as we continue, how hard will the bosses be that are resistant to the better status effects? I'm interested to hear your replies. Sooner or later, we take down Godfrey. Pressing into the Erd Tree, Radagon and Elden Beast stand before us, I quickly found out how tough this fight was going to be. While these bosses are quite challenging themselves, that's not the reason. Instead, it was how tanky the two of them are, with Radagon having high status effect resistance, and Elden Beast being immune to all. We'll have to come back when we have more damage. Before getting back into Radagon's fight, I ended up detouring to a few other bosses. First was Rykard, then Moog, and finally Plassey. Regarding Rykard, I was hesitant to fight him. In challenge runs beforehand, I've had some difficulty getting things to work in his fight. Whether it was sorcery only, I had to basically have 13 blue flasks just to beat him, or madness only where my weapons and damage is near zero. Basically, I've just had some experiences during his fight. Thankfully, we have a plethora of status effects at our disposal, primarily rot and poison. These are ideal, especially in his second phase where you are running away from his flying skulls. Moog is always a hectic but fun battle. That blood flame that he sprays all over the ground can be really tough to avoid. Easily one thing I'm cautious of in his fight. Plassey is still one of my favorite dragon type fights in any Souls game. Rivaling him could only be Baal or Midir. It's crazy to think that this is him heavily nerfed, since he would have more heads if he didn't need to fight Baal. At least interesting to think about what this fight could have been like. In the end, we defeat 3 more Remembrance bosses and receive a hefty sum of runes. Subsequently, we return to the Erd Tree to fight Radagon and Elden Beast once more. Actually, more than a few times. I ended up needing to find new merchants or find new cookbook recipes so that I could have the damage to defeat both of them. Radagon is highly resistant to rot and poison, but at least he can be rotted and poisoned. Because of this, that was my strategy for his fight. Inflict poison and rot, then wait until they ran out and inflict them again. These deadly status effects wither massive chunks of boss's health, so it's definitely worth it. This ultimately gave me an edge over Elden Beast since I had all the consumables left that were pure physical damage or some type of damage type like fire or magic. Even though I did plan things out for a better chance at success, these bosses are still challenging as heck. Radagon with his counter slam grab, and all the Elden Beast projectiles. It meant I was constantly needing to stay on my toes. Ultimately, with skill and a bit of luck, we managed to defeat them. Afterwards, we become the Lord of Frenzied Flame, giving in to madness. I did some prep work collecting various materials that would be useful later on. Afterwards, I decided to head into the Halig Tree, sparring with Loretta for a while. She definitely made me work for the win. Then I had some trouble running in with the local townfolk while I was trying to unlock this chest. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is easily one of the toughest bosses of the main game. Similarly with NPCs, Malenia has a dodge input read, meaning that I have to time the consumables. This makes status effects take slightly longer to proc, alongside potentially missing hits while she dodges. Malenia is infamously known for her health regain, and it proved challenging to overcome. With our low damage compared to a normal weapon, whenever Malenia would heal, it would basically negate about a minute's worth of progress. In her second phase, she transforms into the Goddess of Rot. First phase was already difficult, now we will have to manage new attack combos alongside the Rot status effect. Frost and Bleed are very useful in this fight for a few reasons. Frost pots are excellent in quickly proccing and will interrupt whatever action Malenia is doing. Bleed from the Kukris are also valuable, especially when she does that flower attack. This allows the player to get at least 3 to 4 Kukris for free. Ultimately, we defeat Malenia, and we are now one step closer to completing the main game. The final few areas in the main game require us to travel underground below Limgrave and Altus Plateau. Regal Ancestor Spirit was the first boss we encountered down here. Once again, he's extremely simple. We are also leveled up a fair bit, so these early to mid-game bosses will be easy. Afterwards was the Valiant Gargoyle duo. Focus on the initial gargoyle trying to take him down, so I don't need to fight 2 bosses at once for a long period of time. These champions were surprisingly challenging. Took more than a few attempts, and I had to change my playstyle a bit. End section of that fight where the player needs to fight 3 NPCs at once proved to be the worst. Because we defeated Fia's champions alongside completing her questline, we are now able to fight Lich Dragon Fortisax within Godwin's Dream. This fight is really awesome, especially that banger soundtrack. Now, I have to quickly say that it is unfortunate that we never got a Godwin fight in Elden Ring. Godwin's story really interested me, especially when the game first released. I was hungry for more lore or action. Since his soul left his body and it's just his corrupted body left, I can understand why they didn't. Still, it would have been neat to get like an Everjail fight or something with a spectral version similar to Goldfree. Would you guys have enjoyed a Godwin fight in Elden Ring? Let me and others know down below. In the end, we defeat Fortisax and all the remembrance bosses of the main game. Now, let's head into the DLC. Returning to Mogwin's palace, we enter the Realm of Shadows. The first few things I did in the DLC was run around and collect the various large pots. In the main game, I believe there are 20 cracked pots and 10 ritual pots. Well, the DLC added large pots with new recipes, so now we can have 3 different sets. I eventually went through Castle Ensis until I reached Relana. I opted to play things as cautiously as possible, using the ranged consumable attacks to my advantage. Poison and Rot once again worked wonders. The reason for coming straight here instead of Divine Beasts is to beeline it for Rao Ruins. I'll explain more on this shortly. Sooner or later, we defeat Relana, our first DLC remembrance boss of the run. Going past the Shadow Keep and into the ruins, we press onwards close by to the Church of the Bud. Nearby we find a cookbook, useful for the newly acquired large cracked pots. Now we are able to craft large rot pots, which will be great for many of the bosses on our list. One downside to using this recipe is how costly it can be. The Scarlet Buds are easily obtainable as there are 5 close by to a grace. The other material needed, well, it can be farmed, but is ill-advised, as it's not a guaranteed drop, at least to my knowledge. Said the best option is collecting the Bell Bearing on the way to Midra's Manse. Now we are able to purchase from the Twin Maidens. Unfortunately, these are pretty damn costly, at 2,500 a pop. This is one of the many reasons that I decided to collect that Golden Scarab Talisman early on in the main game. Probably my least favorite boss in the DLC is Divine Beast Dancing Lion. I don't mind his first phase that much, it's mostly his second. That lightning phase makes things extremely difficult, even with multiple range options. I'd say too that it's also extremely hard to tell which attack is coming, since in my opinion, beast-type enemies are super hard to read. 2 notable fights that would aid my claim would be Guardian Ape from Sekiro, Rune Bears in Elden Ring, and so on, but I digress. Divine Beast, while he is difficult, is far from the worst. I made sure to manage my stamina well, attack at opportune times, and heal when needed. Eventually, we take the beast down. Since we already were at the Shadow Keep, I decided to come back to further progress inside. Mesmer is one of the many bosses we can find here, and I opted to use Rot, Poison, and Frost pots in his fight. Rot and Poison slowly wither at his health, and Frost for large damage chunks. Using these in synergy proved to be a good combo. I have to say, out of a lot of the DLC cutscenes, his is one of my favorites, especially his phase 2 transition. Entering the DLC and collecting the large pots means more material farming, both main game and DLC, because this farming took some time. Eventually I found an optimal route which helped save time. Sooner or later I returned to Rao Ruins to fight Ramna, Saint of the Bud. I quickly learned a few things in this fight. First is that Ramna is immune to poison and rot, 2 key pillars in our build. Rot is interesting since Malenia can even be rotted, but Ramna can't. In a previous challenge run I was also curious about this since I was doing a rot only run. One comment on the video theorized how this could have happened. It's interesting to think about. Second thing that I learned was how janky this fight was going to be. The lock-on spot for Ramna is the biggest issue. There are 3 parts to her: the scorpion tail, centipede, and what's left of her previous body in the center. The tough part is that it locks onto the body, which is not as big of a target as the others. With no other lock-on locations, I must learn to overcome this obstacle. It may not seem like much, but I'd say about 20 to 40% of the consumables would miss due to the lock-on. This was the first true challenge of the run, since my bread and butter combo was not going to work alongside the lock-on target. I ended up spending a lot of time in this fight, trying different strategies like up close and aggressive versus range and cautious. Ultimately, we were going to need to come back. I realized it would be a good idea to go around and get some more Skadu tree levels alongside detouring to other bosses. Branching off, I decided to defeat the remaining bosses near the Shadow Keep. This included Commander Gaius and Skadu Tree Avatar. Both these bosses are useful for the runes, but specifically Commander Gaius, when we defeat him, we are able to get multiple Skadu Tree fragments nearby. Returning to Ramna with some increased damage and defense, I was hoping things would go better than before. Well, things turned out extremely well, all things considered. I actually beat her on one of my first attempts back. This is one thing I found in the Souls games. I recommend for anyone struggling on a boss over and over again to explore another area or even take a break from the game. Usually upon returning, you will do much better. Sometimes you can can brute force things, but sometimes you can't, so it's good to revisit things later. At least that's one thing that helps me. In the end, we defeat Ramna, a massive hindrance in this run. Next, I progressed up to the remaining Remembrance bosses. Vale was first on the list. He definitely made me work for that win. Thankfully, a lot of the remaining enemies can be poisoned or rotted. The fights are much more manageable, especially since a lot of these DLC bosses have massive health bars. Afterwards, I progressed near Cerulean Coast to take down this giant, receiving another large cracked pot, then plunge below to fight Putrescent Knight. This fight I do enjoy a lot, especially that one attack where he jumps up high to do a bunch of sweeping attacks. Oof. That thing is sick. Mother of Fingers was next. Before reaching her, we must sound the horns and complete a small quest line. At the final horn location, instead of receiving an item, the player is able to fight the boss. Now this boss's second phase is insane, especially that massive beam area of effect attack. Unless I am extremely far away, it feels damn impossible to get out of safely. Let me know down below if you have found a good strategy around this. Getting to one of my favorite bosses in the DLC, Elden Ring as a whole, and possibly the Soul series, is Midra. Ever since I completed the Frenzied Flame ending, alongside the various questlines associated with it, I found myself hungry for more. I was extremely happy to see them include a boss like this in the DLC. Now, how does Consumables fare against him though? At this point in the game, we have a plethora of consumables at our disposal. From rot to poison, we can inflict various status effects. To quick range options like the daggers, there are many ways to deal massive damage. But to answer the question, consumables are more than sufficient in taking down Midra. And to open this up even further, most of the bosses and enemies in the game are doable with consumables. Shortly though, we will see where consumables are damn near ineffective. Near Limb is the final area in the DLC and the challenge as a whole. Needle Knight Leda and her allies are the first obstacle in our way. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. I previously mentioned early on in the run how NPCs input read the player and are basically gods at dodging. At least in regards to Consumables Only. Well, this fight takes the difficulty of the main game NPCs and dials it up to 10. There are multiple NPCs that the player needs to fight. Thankfully, we didn't complete Freya's or Moore's quests, since that would have made things even more brutal. So the enemies are able to dodge nearly all of my attacks. There are multiple enemies to fight. What else is there, Skilled Fawn? Well, the limited quantity of my consumables heavily limits me. When I complete the Tools Only run, the DLC wasn't out yet, but I would imagine it would play out very similarly, if not worse. With these factors alongside others meant a difficult fight. This was the second massive hindrance in the run, though this was much worse than Ramna could ever be. With a normal weapon, it is also challenging, but way more doable. Knowing that I need to adapt or at least change my strategy, I was contemplating what to do. A few things was that some of these NPCs are immune to rot, so I decided not to use that status effect. If need be, we had a few set of poison items. Because of this, I wanted to go with even more damaging consumables. After multiple attempts, even then I would have extreme trouble. Eventually, I succumbed to a few things. First was using the friendly NPC nearby. I summoned him for the fight, but even when they were focused on him, they would input read my attacks, dodging constantly. Next, I wanted to get some items that would inflict madness, since in my madness only run, I had success with it. I grinded for the various frenzied flame pots, and even then it was ineffective. Knowing that there was very little left besides just switching to a weapon myself, I decided to try one last thing. Heading to Nokron, I got the Mimic tier and proceeded to upgrade it. Now, I'm not against summons or anything like that. In fact, I advocate for you to play the way that you want or enjoy. I personally find it more fun and challenging for myself. Regarding this situation, things are too brutal for me to handle alone. In the end, even after getting the Mimic tier and trying to get him to use consumables, things were just not in my favor. This is definitely one thing that was frustrating about this run. The NPCs were insanely challenging, especially in regards to Needle Knight Leda, more so battling the game's mechanics themselves. All in all, this was damn difficult and took a long time to finish. At the top of a near limb, Promised Consort Radahn greets us. He's the last Remembrance boss of the DLC and the challenge as a whole. Radahn's main game counterpart is very weak to rot, and same as this version. Using rot in his second phase, things will go more smoothly. His first phase, I poisoned him and then used the Kukris. I found using both poison and rot in his first phase was extremely overkill and made proccing rot later more difficult. Radahn is the pinnacle of challenge in the DLC. He's ultra aggressive and has various attacks with different attributes, whether it's holy, magic, or fire. One thing to note is that this is post-patch Radahn, so that one sweeping attack is much more tamed. Recently, I got into Berserk, and it's interesting to see the similarities between Griffith and Miquella. Maybe in the future we can look at some similarities between the From Software lineup and Berserk panels. Even though I've gone through the DLC many times, this fight is always going to be difficult. Usually in this fight, I've grown accustomed to using the buckler shield to parry. It was fun to try a different playstyle. Ultimately, we defeat Radahn, consort of Miquella. This has been Elden Ring with consumables only. Well, mostly. There was that one section with Needle Knight Leda that proved troublesome, but other than that, we defeated enemies and bosses with consumables and no spirit summons. On this journey, we defeated all the Remembrance bosses in the main game and DLC. Basically used no armor, since the helmet provides extremely minor benefits in regards to defense. Lastly, we used glitches and exploits when things proved to be tough. This I relate to Ramina's fight. Now, how tough is consumables only, and should you try this in one of your playthroughs? Well, I would say regarding its difficulty, it's maybe a medium tiered challenge. It wasn't super difficult, but also wasn't super easy. Should you try this? Yeah, I would definitely give it a shot. Know that at times the material grind will be long and tiring, but just toss on some tunes or something to pass the time. Thank you for watching the video. Make sure to hit the like button, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. This greatly helps you support me and the channel, alongside pushing the video out to others who may be interested. Try to do something kind for someone today, whether it's a small or large gesture. This is your boy Skilled Fawn, and I'm out.